I think I made you the host, so I think you might be the one that have to start the recording. Is that right?
I gotcha.
Thank you. Okay, so now that you've met some of the folks making this possible today, I just want to thank you again for coming. I'm so grateful. This is my first time hosting something like this, and I didn't know what to expect, but I'm really inspired that so many of you showed up for this kind of conversation. At the end of June, Emma, Amanda, Deborah, and I, and hundreds of other people participated in Showing Up for Racial Justice, also referred to as SURJ, National Abolition House Party, where we received the same content that I'm going to share with you today. They asked us to apply, and we were accepted into their training program, which is a pilot program. This is something new. And that was to train over the past 6 weeks to organize our own abolition house parties. So here we are. SURJ believes it is essential to gather in community in whatever shape that's taking now, to connect with folks close to us around anti-racial political education. So this curriculum was developed by White People for Black Lives, which follows leaders and organizations, including but not limited to Angela Davis, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Mariame Kaba, and Critical Resistance, who have been fighting abolition for decades. I am not an expert in this work, and much of the content we look at today was developed by those folks mentioned above, and I'm extremely grateful for their work. You will all get a copy of the slides along with any links that we drop in the chat during our time together, so no stress. I'm trying to capture everything that you see in here today. We got you covered. And I hope that you'll be able to absorb as much as you can and get curious about what comes up for you. And if you want to, you can drop your email address and your name in the chat. You can do it to me privately if you want. You can also include your city and phone number if you want. That way we can stay in touch, because I'm getting deeply involved with Decarcerate Louisiana and multiple efforts around abolition. So, and you don't necessarily have to also just live in the same area as me. This is a national effort. So we're going to, so the purpose of this session is to provide you with information and tools around abolition, and to discuss the history of policing and prisons in the US that brought us to this moment. We'll look at the ineffectiveness of inadequate reforms and how they're different from the abolitionist steps needed to create a world where we don't need prisons and police. These steps are possible, and they're happening right now. So while I may not be able to answer all of your questions, and I know this topic tends to bring up a lot of questions, hopefully many of them will be answered during the presentation or by some of the more experienced folks who are on this call who may be abolitionists already. So I'll also be sending out an abolition FAQ in a follow-up email with everybody. And just know that this is just the beginning of a conversation for some of us and for many of us. I also want to take this time to suggest that you maybe have a pen and paper handy if possible, or some way to jot down your thoughts or questions, because there will be a couple of moments when we'll ask you to reflect on some of the topics individually at certain moments. So, White People for Black Lives is a white anti-racist collective and activist project within the national network of SURJ. White People for Black Lives is the Los Angeles affiliate of SURJ, and their primary solidarity partner is Black Lives Matter Los Angeles, along with other LA-based organizations. If you want more information, you can visit awarela.org, and Amanda is going to drop that in the chat for you right now. Showing Up for Racial Justice, or SURJ, is a national multiracial network of groups and individuals working to undermine white supremacy and to work toward racial justice. Through community organizing, mobilizing, and education like this, SURJ moves white people to act as part of a multiracial majority for justice. I just want to say I think somebody might need to mute. Members are asked to organize from a place of deep mutual interest while fighting for racial and economic justice alongside Black, Indigenous, and people of color-led movements. So if anyone would like more information about SURJ, you can visit showingupforracialjustice.org, and Amanda is also going to drop that link in the chat for you as well. So you might be asking yourself, why political education when there are thousands of people in the streets every day? Actually, they're estimating it in the millions. When this feels like a time to take urgent action, why spend time educating ourselves? So we do it to ground ourselves in political and historical learning, because dominant culture and media intentionally and consistently misdirect and misinform us. We need to build a shared understanding of our real history, which isn't taught in school, so that we know what it is that we're up against. Political education allows us to do this work collectively and build both a shared language and a shared framework for understanding our situation. This allows us to then take more effective action. So I know some of you on the call may be wondering whether you support abolition or what it even means. And I myself am still learning it. It's not just a straight, cut and dry situation. There's a lot of complexity. We live in a complex society. And I also know some of you may be greatly impacted by the police and prison systems in this country. So we acknowledge the emotional work of connecting these systems to actual experiences. And we want to hold space for all of the feelings that might come up during this session. We're grateful to have you joining us no matter what place you're coming from or starting from today. So on that note, if you feel like it, go ahead and put either a 1, 2, or 3 in the chat. 1 being, you came to this because you don't actually know that much about abolition yet, but you really want to. 2 being somewhere in the middle, and 3, you already feel like you're an abolitionist. And there's no expectation that everyone will leave here today as an abolitionist. This is intended to be a space where we can educate ourselves about what abolition is so that we can better understand how to support or be in solidarity with Black-led organizations that are abolitionists, such as Movement for Black Lives and Black Lives Matter.
And whether you've been doing anti-racist work for years or whether you're new to this work, I'm seeing a range in the chat. I'm sure you're aware that we are in the midst of a dramatic whirlwind moment. So people are ready for change. And since the inception of Black Lives Matter in 2013, and even much prior to that, organizers across the country have been pushing tirelessly for the defunding of the police. But even Patrisse Cullors, one of the co-founders of BLM, has stated that this moment in time feels different. And there lies so much power in organized numbers. We're seeing the numbers of vocal emerging activists grow and grow. And it's estimated that 23 million people on Turtle Island or North America have taken part in a protest for racial justice since March. 23 million. Perhaps throughout the recent news cycle, you've been hearing the word abolition more and more. Today, we're talking about abolishing both the police and the prison systems in this country. They've proven time and time again that they are ineffective at helping our communities address underlying issues, and they often cause more harm to those who interact with them, particularly Black and Brown communities.
So it may be confusing or scary to imagine a world without police, but realizing that supporting abolition is actually a bold commitment to effective care, and having our worldview rooted in the truth can help keep us focused on what abolition is really asking us to consider and build. So I'm going to share a little bit more about my personal story that's informing informing why I'm thinking about abolition now. I hope that you also consider, long after this abolition house party, how your life is shaped or informed by policing in prisons. What would be different for you and your loved ones if we invested in housing, education, and health instead of police and prisons? This struggle is very personal to me because I believe that my youngest brother, Jason, who took his own life rather than going to jail, would still be here today if he had gotten the mental health services and the support that he needed. He was a beautiful baby boy, biracial, adopted at 7 days old. And Jason had many struggles in his life around identity, untreated mental illness, physical ailments that led to opioid addiction, which led to difficulty keeping a job and depression. And he had PTSD from a violent encounter during a road rage incident, after which the state trooper advised my brother to get a gun to defend himself, not knowing my brother's very troubled mental state and what that resulted in. And so that's just one of the reasons that's very personal to me why I got involved in this. I want to apologize because we had this fancy thing where we were going to like launch a poll. But what we're going to do is Amanda is going to put this in the chat for everybody. And so there's going to be 2 questions. So with each question, we're going to ask you to respond from a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being not at all, and 5 being completely. So the first question is, when you were growing up, when you were a kid, think back to when you were a kid, how strongly did you believe that the police made your community a safer space for everyone? Put a 1 if you were like, no, I did not think of the police as keeping me safe. Or 5 being, yeah, I totally believe that the police were keeping me and my family and everybody safe. And we'll just wait till folks have a chance to think about that and reply. What are we seeing in the chat, Amanda? I mean, yeah, Amanda or Emma?
We're seeing 1 1, 2 3s, and 2 4s.
Okay. So the second question is, now, present day, now how strongly do you believe that the police make your community a safer space for everyone? 1 being not at all and 5 being completely. So it looks like there were a bunch of 1s and 2s. Yeah, so what we're talking, what are we talking about when we say abolition? There are 3 key components that need to be highlighted. And so we'll use a working definition given to us by Critical Resistance to clarify those points. Critical Resistance is an abolitionist organization seeking to end the prison industrial complex. Abolition is a political vision that seeks to eliminate the need for prisons, policing, and surveillance by creating sustainable alternatives. The second aspect is that it's not just about eliminating buildings full of cages, full of human beings. It's also about reorganizing society, because the prison industrial complex we're working to end feeds on and perpetuates structural oppression through punishment and violence and the control of literally millions of people. This is not an isolated system, so abolition is a broad strategy. The word vision speaks to the third facet of this movement. Abolitionists believe we have to build models today that can represent how we want to live in the future. We have to develop practical strategies for taking steps that move us toward making our ideal vision a reality. Abolition is about empowering ourselves and others to believe that things really could be different, and then living that vision in our daily lives. It's both a practical organizing tool and a long-term goal. So, abolition at its core is not just about being against police and prisons, but also about being for a different, better world where there's liberation, justice, healthy relationships, care, and respect for everybody. It's about creating sustainable alternatives where we honor everyone's humanity so deeply that we don't need prisons and police. In essence, it's about changing the way we relate to each other and how we react when people cause harm. When we think about the whole system, it can feel big and distant. But what it comes down to is relationships, how we relate to each other in our communities, and taking steps that move us toward the world we want to live in. We do not have to accept the framework of society as it is. We can change it.
It can feel overwhelming to think about changing an entire system, but we need to see that it's not just an end goal, but it is also a process of incremental changes that gets us to this new way of being and relating to each other that Andrea was talking about. The late Rose Braz, a longtime staffer and member of Critical Resistance, emphasized this point in a 2008 interview. A prerequisite to seeking any social change is the naming of it. In other words, even though the goal we seek may be far away, unless we name it and fight for it today, it will never come. So let's take a deep breath together. Let's ground ourselves in this present. Feel free to, like I said, take a position if you need that. This can be a good time to rest your eyes or look away from your screen. For the next 3 minutes, we're going to ask you to do just a little individual reflection. This is just for you. You can journal or whatever, doodle, meditate, whatever you need to do to process any of the following questions, which Amanda's going to throw in the chat and you can see up on the screen right here. So when you hear about the facets of abolition, what feelings come up for you? What's something you just heard that you've never heard before? Or where do you feel hesitation or resistance to what you just heard? Also, how are the ideas described similar or different to what you thought about abolition before attending this session? And we're going to give you a little music and we'll see you on the other side.
We need a miracle, spirit of the gold stakes. Light up this prayer grass in my hand, take it to the most high. Yeah. We need a blessing tonight, stand by our side as we fight. Screaming out, water is life, a miracle, spirit of the gold stakes. Light up this prayer grass in my hand, take it to the most high. Yeah. We need a blessing tonight, stand by our side as we fight. Screaming out, water is life.
Hey yo, all around the world, my sisters and my brothers hurt. So I spoke this word for the heartbeat of Mother Earth. I say a prayer and put it down for what it's worth. For those who oppose and only see color first. For my 2 sons, my daughter and wife, and the father of lights, I started the fight. Started in mics, ready to die like a martyr tonight. With my fist in the sky, saying water is life. And yo, it takes a nation of millions to hold us back. This is treaty land, we see these scams. Hey yo, we know the facts. Evil collapses and cowers in fear. The hour is near, let the world unite with the power of prayer. Yeah, our family rise, defy gravity. We gon' keep on rhyming and climbing and shine happily. A masterpiece with my whole body glistening. Hey yo, we still here, is there anybody listening? listening? From Flint, Michigan to my Egyptian friends, Minnesota, all around the world. Are you
We
listening?
need a miracle, spirit of the ghost saints. Light up this prayer that's in my hand. Take it to the most high. We need a blessing tonight. Stand by our side, side as we fight. Screaming out, water is life, a miracle. Spirit of the ghost saints. Light up this prayer that's in my hand. Take it to the most high. We need a blessing tonight. Stand by our side, side as we fight. Screaming out, water is life.
Walking thonker, we in the valley of the beast with these wicked monsters. When we trying to keep it peace and they take us under. Is it better up or redder underneath my bomber? We was pleading to the governors, they need Obamas. We ain't need one alive, just some clean water. Just a little bit of life for our sons and daughters. If a penny for your thoughts, then I'm throwing quarters. Cause they never think about all the people poorer. Only rich and the white get the right to water. If we fold or if we fight, we becoming martyrs. Throwing federal charges, they let go the lawyers. I salute the true courage of the red warriors. Against our laws, my people pushing forward. Wish we had them at the pilgrims at the border. With a travel ban, pushed them back into the water. Put a sign up on the rock saying don't lauder. Or maybe a tall wall would have been in order. Cause we gave them liberty and they gave us slaughter. No land of the free for my forefathers. Now we're praying for miracles with tobacco offers. To a power that's higher than any man-made office. As the prophecy unfolds, there's no wins or losses. God trumps all self-proclaiming bosses. In the end, when they squandered all the earth's resources, they will learn that their children cannot eat their coffers.
We need a miracle, spirit of the ghost saints. Light up this prayer that's in my hand. Take it to the most high. We need a blessing tonight. Stand by our side, side as we fight. Screaming out, water is life, a miracle. Spirit of the ghost saints. Light up this prayer that's in my hand. Take it to the most high. We need a blessing tonight. Stand by our side, side as we fight. Screaming out, water is life.
All right, welcome back, everyone. Deborah's going to talk to us next.
Yeah, thanks for taking that moment to reflect. At the beginning, we said we'd explore the difference between, excuse me, revolution and abolish. These are both words you probably heard a lot recently. Actually, today, was it today? Yeah, today on The View, they were actually talking about the difference between abolitionists and defund the police. So that was kind of interesting. Think back to the abolition definition that we provided. It talks about building practical strategies to move towards a world we've been dreaming of. This definition draws an important distinction between what is often called reformist reforms and abolitionist reforms. So many of you can see what we have up on the screen. Reformist reforms are changes that continue to expand the power of policing and prisons. They don't actually lessen the existence or size of those systems and often make them more permanent. So they give the idea that policing can be done right, rather than seeing the systemic role poking plays in perpetuating harm. So abolitionist reforms, on the other hand, ending the overall negative impacts and excessive power of policing and prisons so that resources can be moved into programs and community services that will meet our needs. So let's break down some specifics. You may be able to see here on one side, we have the reformist reforms in policing. Body cams, for instance, actually increase police funding, as well as tools and technology that they have at their disposal, like surveillance, armed vehicles, and various weapons. All of this increases the overall scale without changing the culture of police violence or power. Body cams simply document this inevitable and awful and often legal protected abuse. So here are a few examples. Like, you know, with George Floyd, we saw something very different on the body cams where those recordings were eventually released than what we saw on the recording of the persons who was recording this and who released it, you know, on the news media. Those are, you know, those are two very different perspectives. Those police video cameras taken in and of themselves would not have provided what we saw on the screen regarding George Floyd's murder. Now, on the contrary, abolitionist reforms would include require the cops to be liable for misconduct settlements. They're currently not. For example, in Los Angeles, when the LAPD is sued for misconduct, the police department responsible is not held liable. The city is. Those are our taxes. Misconduct settlements are paid out of an LA city's general fund. So, and this absence of accountability in the police department is not just something seen in the LAPD. This is the reality all over the country. Cities like New York, Louisville, Baltimore, Austin, and New Orleans, and probably where you live too, they all function in this way. Making an abolitionist step would be requiring cops to pay for their own misconduct settlements and ending qualified immunity. This would increase community-based budgets because local governments wouldn't be paying for policing's harm against the community. Policing and all its costs are not essential components of safety. They just aren't. Community members should not pay for policing's inevitable violence. This would reduce the expansion of tools used by police and creates pressure for police to account for their actions. This is one of the steps. Decrease the size and capacity of systems of policing that moves us towards abolition.
Yeah, so there are a lot of working parts to that, and those are the things that abolitionists address, including reforms on many different levels. So yeah, so Emma's going to talk a little bit more and get us started on the history.
Yeah, so I hope that helps demystify reforms and abolition a little bit. As Andrea said, let's look at how we got here. We have this quote up here by Maya Angelou: "History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again." So for us to understand the power and devastating impact of police and prisons today, we have to look at their long and inhumane history. You can trace the lineage of prisons and police back to slavery and before. These systems are inextricably linked and have direct ties to the atrocities and the violence that we see today. But remember, there was a time before police and prisons, and there will be a time after. So I want to acknowledge that we'll be reviewing over 400 years of terrifying history, and we're going to be doing this in about 10 minutes. So many important details and events we won't be able to cover. So take note of where you're at, and this is just the beginning of our relearning.
Thank you, Emma. Yeah, so for around 250 years, slavery fueled the American economy and continues to do so today. White landowners and enslavers, and now industries and corporations, relied on exploited, forced Black labor to amass a concentration of wealth. And I was looking at these slides earlier. If you'll notice, the badge for the slave patroller looks exactly like the sheriff's badge. Fearing rebellions, patrols of white men developed as one of the earliest and most prolific forms of early policing in the US. Their job was to control the movement and behaviors of enslaved Black people through dehumanization, torture, kidnapping, rape, and other violent acts. Enslaved people were seen as property, and the role of police was to protect white property over Black people. Policing of Black bodies was seen as the role of the quote-unquote good white citizen. In 1776, the colonies formed into a nation state and became the USA. A national militia was formed in the effort to remove the British, and a national constitution provided for the maintenance of a military and national guard. This was the beginning of a militarized police state. Though schools may teach July 4th as a celebration of freedom and independence, enslaved people didn't gain their independence until June 19th, 1865, or Juneteenth. And some of you may have heard the speech that Frederick Douglass gave in, I believe it was Rochester, New York, where he said, "What is the 4th of July to the slave?" The local patrols and the national militias often worked together to return enslaved people to bondage. This period established, quote unquote, security for white male landowners who made up 15% of the population at the expense of the other 85%. Through indigenous attempted genocide, African slavery, and denying political rights to poor whites and women. Now, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution claimed to end slavery. However, there was an intentional loophole that slave labor could continue, quote unquote, as punishment for a crime. This created an incentive for whites in power to arrest Black people and put them in jails and prisons to exploit their labor, to continue to exploit their labor, and to prevent their entry into wage labor and political power. Emancipation was followed immediately by Black codes, which were laws created to restrict Black people's freedom, designed to re-enslave the Black community for harmless everyday actions like owning property or being absent from work or jaywalking. The white corporate economy, AKA capitalism, also profited off free prison labor with convict leasing programs, which continues today, where prisoners were leased out to do work at private plantations, coal mines, and railroad yards. Clearly, slavery took on a new form. And today there are examples of the gas and oil industry here in Louisiana using prison slave labor, and some very well-known corporations like Walmart, for example, uses prison slave labor. The breadth of policing continued to broaden as parole and probation systems were formed, which expanded the role of state surveillance. Incarceration for profit, paying for one's parole services while not being able to find a job and going back to prison when one can't pay. That's an example. The government created state police forces to meet the demands of corporations, to squash union organizing and labor strikes, because these companies didn't want to bear the expense themselves. And by the 1930s, every state had some form of state police agency. So what we're talking about is corporations wanting cheap or free labor. Jim Crow laws and segregation made it illegal for Black people to try and operate as white people did in the public sphere. thus preventing social advancement and access to wealth. Incarceration and police violence were tools the police used when Black people dared to challenge these racist laws. And that's why it was either Bernie Sanders, I think, who said economic justice is racial justice. So we'll see in the next slide. During the civil rights movement, various police agencies like the FBI and SWAT were established with expanded quote unquote crime fighting responsibilities and power. Programs like COINTELPRO, which means the Counterintelligence Program, which is a secret FBI program, were created to actively monitor and target Black liberatory groups and disrupt civil rights activism and organizing and Black power activities for 2 decades. Perhaps they never stopped. The Black Panther Party was seen as the greatest internal threat to the country by the FBI for simply trying to create cooperative security for the Black community through multiracial grassroots organizing. And for that, COINTELPRO sought to dismantle this movement for justice by assassinating and incarcerating key leaders like Fred Hampton. Those same police were finally able to form unions themselves in the 60s and 70s after decades of quashed attempts. But since their inception, police unions have consistently and successfully protected police from any accountability for their continued misconduct and violence, as we see today, again, in the form of qualified immunity. Learning about the power of police unions was one of the biggest things I learned when I first took this training. Additionally, the prison population in the United States was largely consistent throughout most of the 20th century, but this started to change in the 1970s. In 1970, the US prison population was about 350,000. The war on drugs and racial profiling in the 70s began to establish what we call mass incarceration in the United States. And by 1990, the US prison population was over 1.1 million people. So 350,000 in 1970, 20 years later, 1.1 million. The $30 billion 1994 crime bill allowed for a massive expansion for the prison system and provided law enforcement with money and incentives to make as many drug arrests as possible. This caused further criminalization of poverty. The further criminalization of poverty worked to move many of the most economically marginalized, including youth, into the prison system. And by 2000, the US prison population had reached more than 2 million people. Today, 2.3 million human beings are behind bars, their freedom taken away from them. So again, in 1970, it was 350,000. The US has the highest rate of incarceration in the world. We make up only 5% of the global population and 25% of the world's prisons. So I'm going to ask Amanda to put a bunch of these links into the chat because here in Louisiana, we're fighting for the rights and care of incarcerated youth, especially since the COVID breakout. You'll read in that article by the by Frances Maidson, who's a friend of mine in the LA Illuminator, about how when COVID happened, instead of sending kids home to isolate them, for example, they put them in solitary confinement, which in international terms is considered torture. All right, Emma's gonna help us continue to learn more about this.
Y'all, before the incredible victories of advocates recently during this COVID-19 pandemic crisis, Los Angeles County jails, for instance, had an average daily population nearing 22,000 people, which made LA's jail system the biggest in the world. Police have also become more militarized and, especially post 9/11, have widely increased their surveillance tactics. They were equipped with military-grade weapons, which they continue to use on US citizens. Tear gas was banned internationally by the Geneva Convention of 1925 as a chemical weapon of war, but it is still commonly used to attack protesters today. But also, despite all of this, we remember there was a time before police and prisons, and there will be a time after.
Thank you, Emma. And now Deborah's going to help us do a little reflection.
Now we'd like to ask you for a little reflection on that very brief overview of history. Which piece of history stood out for you personally? Was there a period you thought you understood, but now recognize that you were misinformed about? So go ahead and put your answers in the chat if you would. Make sure you selected all panelists or everyone in the drop down so that we can all check in, okay?
Yeah, so if you have an idea of which piece of history stood out to you the most, the history of policing and prisons in the US, or something that you thought that you really knew about but didn't, and that you just learned about, yeah, let us know. Yeah, Penny, the police evolved from the slave patrols. Yeah, Harry, the exponential growth of the prison population over the past several decades. Yeah, Joey, the 13th Amendment. Slavery never actually ended. All right, yeah, so as we've seen, this country has a deep and devastating history of prisons and police that spans over 400 years. These violent systems continue to operate as they were designed, to protect and promote wealthy white business owners and communities at the expense of everyone else. Today, the total number of people in US jails is 746,000. Now listen to this, 74% of those people have not even been convicted of a crime. That's about 552,000 people, 500,000. Because of local bail practices, most people are locked up simply because they cannot afford to get out. We have been misdirected to think that these systems make us safer, and that locking up 2.3 million people solves the challenges in our society. Centuries of using this futile logic proves that this simply isn't true. And this misdirection is the result of a culture and media that feeds stereotypes and engages in fear baiting. This idea that if we put anybody in prison, anything will get better is a lie. Our systems make no commitment to real accountability, rehabilitation, justice, or community well-being. These systems have segregated and isolated us from each other, destroyed community, which is where our ultimate safety and support come from. They have instilled misplaced fear about where the problems are and how to solve them. Our community's greatest risk and harm come from the violence perpetuated by these systems and the systems they uphold. This is why reform is not possible. You can't just fix the system that was built on violence. punishment, racism, and the profiting off the forced labor of others, you have to rebuild it from the ground up. Angela Davis, who has spent decades championing and researching abolition, wrote in 1998, "Prisons do not disappear social problems, they disappear human beings. Homelessness, unemployment, drug addiction, mental illness, and illiteracy are only a few of the problems that disappear from public view when the human beings contending with them are relegated to cages." Social problems are criminalized rather than addressed. And now we have 2.3 million people forced into cages. When they're finally released, our system continues to control and surveil them through probation and parole systems that further obstruct people from accessing the opportunities, programs, and communities that could help them. It is a time to directly address the fundamental needs of the people.
So to connect this history we just discussed very briefly to the new abolitionist movement today, we're going to watch a video with Black Lives Matter activist Janiyah Future Khan from May 27th, 2017. In this video, they explain how we can abolish the whole criminal punishment system through transformative justice. Give me a second, I'll throw it up for you.
Not just one bad apple, the whole damn tree is rotten. I think when people hear that we're anti-police, they think it's going to be chaos. The new abolitionist movement it's about transformative justice, non-prison, non-police-based strategies for dealing with violence and crisis in our communities. Who hasn't had a bad day? Who hasn't felt anxious or depressed? The question, should anybody deserve to die because of it? The police's sole responsibility is to manufacture criminals. So here you have for-profit prisons. When you create space, you create a demand. That means that bodies have to fill those prisons. And we have seen that it's largely transgender people, it's Black people, it is Native people, it's Latinx people. When you have that demand, then you also have to create incentives. That trickles down to police, who also now have the incentive of creating criminals. It's not about justice anymore, it's about profit. I think we start with the demilitarization of the police. Police don't need assault weapons to protect people. The second thing that we can do is really look at police budgets and create models and economies for that divestment from the institution of policing and the reinvestment in community models. That means taking money out of police budgets and slowly phasing out police because we don't actually need them in our communities. They don't keep people safe. You know, when you're looking at it from the lens of race in this country, it's absolutely easier to manufacture criminals around that. When people's skin becomes weaponized, particularly Black skin, a book becomes a gun, a cell phone becomes a gun, a bag of Skittles becomes a gun. We don't have some personal war with individual police officers. What we do have is deep concern and a fight against the institution of policing. Undocumented communities know that they can't call the police in the event that crisis happens. A lot of Black communities know that too. And so entire mosques, churches, communities, they have agreements where they won't call the police should something happen. And in its place, we've seen such a wonderful and diverse response when it comes to intervention in our communities. We've seen people rise up with trainings around mental health crisis, intimate partner violence crisis. We've seen rapid response justice teams, and I think that's really what we need to be building. Revolution isn't just the ending of something, it's the beginning of something new.
So, you know, revolution isn't just the beginning, isn't just the ending of something. We have to think about it as a beginning, something new. Wow, we just went over a lot of information. So let's take a breath together, check in with yourself, and drop in the chat just one word to describe how you're feeling right now. If you'd like to share it in the chat, that would be great. Just make sure that you're chatting to everyone and not just someone privately, okay?
Radical, hopeful, numb, inspired, overwhelmed a bit. Yeah, I think it's even possible to feel all of those things all at once. Confused. Mm-hmm. So, as a way to dig deeper into the conversation of police abolition, we're going to listen to an excerpt from the Appeal podcast, episode 7, What Abolitionists Mean When They Talk About Abolition. This is a conversation with host Adam H. Johnson and William C. Anderson, abolitionist, journalist, and co-author of As Black as Resistance from July 2018. And there's a term that comes up in the podcast, it's austerity. Austerity deals with reducing government budget deficits by reducing spending on social services and balancing budgets on the backs of the most vulnerable. This will give some context to their conversation. So we're going to listen to that now.
Okay, so in your piece, you talk about how austerity rhetoric is very favorable to policing, and the austerity fetish that is in our country, it is increasingly in Europe, goes hand in hand with what Professor Stephanie Coleman at Northwestern University, Pritzker School of Law, calls the, quote, scarcity logic. And she says it's always been used to simultaneously starve police misconduct investigations and invest in suppression squads and surveillance activities. What does she mean by this? When we talk about how austerity and police go hand in hand, what are we talking about?
It's basically a recognition of how the communities that are most in need are starved. They're intentionally starved, and at the same time told that there are not enough resources for them. There's not enough to give to them to meet their needs that they very well deserve. It's this use of the police in this really, really terrible way that it's like a big circle, you know. It's like you have on one hand the austerity saying we don't have enough, like we have to take from the resources that communities need. Like maybe some people might, you know, describe that as taking away from people's human rights. And the same token saying that there's not enough money constantly reinvesting into police. And so there's like this circle that happens where at the time that you're starving communities and you're intentionally strickening resources from communities and saying that there's not enough, you're reinvesting into the police. So it goes back to what I was saying earlier about communities not having enough resources and not having their needs met, and creating more problems through not allowing the resources that communities need to get to them. And then saying that there is money for the police and that we have to put more into the police at the same time. So it's like, it's a very purposeful connection that's happening there, because again, if you were putting the resources and investing into the communities in the first place, the problems that you're supposedly solving with the police, which are not actually being solved with the police, would be lessened. You know, it wouldn't be as much of an issue. Put the resources into the community, like give people what they need. Stop, you know, allowing corporations to amass these astronomical amounts of wealth, and have an actual system where people, you know, have to pay taxes, like just do normal stuff. Like corporations are not even paying taxes in this country. Yeah. And it's like, then they say like, oh, we don't have enough money for communities that have, you know, high crime rates. What? Yes, you do. You have enough money. Like at the very least, we could be demanding that corporations pay taxes.
I want to just end this section with another quote from William C. Anderson. I think that we have to push against the idea that reform is even something we should be viewing as a goal. I think that reform has a lot of the logics of liberalism kind of built into it. And I think that we just need to be telling people abolition is necessary. Folks like myself and others who are considered radical, quote unquote, it's unfortunate that these views, everybody should have healthcare, or that education should be free, or that we need to live in a society free from police, are considered radical because they're actually normal and they're actually not that controversial in many places. So it's really a testament to how backwards things are in the USA. I'll pass it to Deborah.
This is a lot of information we have been giving you. So we're going to take a few minutes to just, we're going to play you some music, and I want you to just change your physical position, take your eyes off the screen, and we'll give an extra moment to grab a glass of water, ask someone to bring you a snack, whatever. But for the next few minutes, just reflect on any of the following questions. So, what do you feel after listening to this clip? What did it specifically bring up for you? If you were in charge of the city's budget, how would you distribute the funds? What community resources or programs would be important alternatives to invest in over the police? So we're going to give you a few minutes. We're going to play you some music, and see you in a bit.
Bound in jail, had no money for to go their bail. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on, hold on, hold on, hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on, hold on, hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on. Paul and Silas began to shout. Doors popped open and all walked out. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on. Hold on. Hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on. Well, the only chains we can stand are the chains of hand in hand. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on. Got my hand on the freedom power. Wouldn't take nothing for my journey now. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on. Hold on. Hold on. Hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on. Hold on, hold on, hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize.
Hey, sorry to cut off that awesome song, folks, but I just want to make sure that we get through everything that we need to. Stop that, Siri. Okay, so yeah, we have the power together to create the world we want to live in, and we just have to imagine it, name it, and have the courage to demand it and fight for it. So you just dreamed about what community resources would be important alternatives to invest in, and I want to offer that you share in the chat, what's one program or service that you think is the most important to fund in your community? Amanda's going to drop the question in the chat for you. Yeah, what is it that you can visualize and imagine in your community that's just going to make it better instead of giving that money to the police? Investing in our children. Hell yes. Childcare. Yes, indeed. More teachers. Yes, Elizabeth. Food as a human right. Yes, ma'am. Food sovereignty. Affordable housing, Deborah. Yes, indeed. More arts education. Trauma and nervous system education. Free and easily accessible mental health care. Thank you, Penny. I agree on that. Yeah, and restorative justice. Healthy ways to navigate conflict. Conflict is inevitable, but we have options for how we handle it, right? So some of the other ideas from the other Abolition House Party were, no capitalism, no scarcity, investment in community resources, response numbers to call that are not 911, teaching an accurate history in school about police and history. History is still happening today. And getting the police out of our schools. And quality education, affordable housing, and empowered youth. So yes. Yes, there are viable alternative realities to having police in our streets and prisons in our communities. Building a world without them will need community-led alternatives to harm that lead with care. Here are some visions for what that better world could look like. From conflict transformation. And if you want to put a plus sign in the chat, if you'd like to read one of these and help us, then I get to hear all your beautiful voices. Would someone like to read the first one? Harry, do you want to read that first thing? Okay, Amanda, thanks.
Some folks are sleeping on benches in the park. Imagine a city employee comes by and checks in to see if they need a place to sleep, food, water, or healthcare. An hour later, those who wanted a different place to sleep have one. Isn't that public safety?
Great. Deborah?
So someone is behaving erratically, and there's a lot of people behaving erratically out there right now, and in harm's way. Imagine texting a number and unarmed, urgent responders trained in behavioral and mental health services comes within like 5 minutes. An hour later, that person is safe and getting the support that they need. Isn't that public safety?
Someone is selling drugs to youth who are overdosing. Imagine being connected to a substance use service that intervenes in harmful drug transactions. Youth are supported in healthy outcomes, and the seller takes accountability for harm. Isn't that public safety? All right, y'all, don't make me call on you. Harry, you want to read one?
Sure. You are experiencing intimate partner violence. Imagine texting a number and a trauma-informed crisis intervention specialist meets you in a safe place. An hour later, you are working together to make a plan that will keep you safe long-term. Isn't that public safety?
Thank you so much. Ben?
You are experiencing a mental health crisis and afraid. Imagine you call 311 and a first responder trained in mental health comes to your door. 1 hour later, you are in a safe place with your consent with plans for follow-up care. Isn't that public safety?
Thank you, Ben. Kara?
Someone seems to be snooping in your car windows on your block. Imagine calling your neighbors who are trained in self-defense and de-escalation and approaching the person. An hour later, the conflict is resolved and the person responsible is getting the support they need. Isn't that public safety?
Your friends are intoxicated and fighting, but you don't want them to get in trouble. Imagine you call 311 and a crisis intervention team comes to your door. An hour later, your friends are sleeping it off at home. Isn't that public safety? Emma? Penny? Thank you, Penny.
You don't realize that your brake lights aren't working. Imagine a city employee signals for you to pull over and says, hey, how about I replace those lights for you here so no one gets hurt. An hour later, both lights work and you're at home. Isn't that public safety?
Yes, indeed. All right. Who wants to read the last one?
I can finish it up for you, Andrea.
Thank you, ma'am.
Incidents of gun violence are rising in the neighborhood. Imagine a trauma-informed crisis intervention team works with community activists to disarm and de-escalate conflicts. People doing harm are connected to services that address the underlying problem. Isn't that public safety?
Thank you all so much. These are all great visions, albeit not fully fleshed out for what safe communities can look like. But some of you may still be wondering about some other scenarios, like what do we do about murderers and rapists and sociopaths and quote unquote dangerous people? Abolitionist Dean Spade and many others, including survivors of violence, remind us that most people murder people that they know well, often as part of complex family and relationship violence dynamics. TV makes us think prisons are full of murderers who would go on killing sprees if released. That is an inaccurate portrayal of how violence most commonly happens and who is in prison right now. Most sexual assault happens between people who know each other rather than the stranger serial rapist portrayed on TV. Most sexual assault is not reported, and most people who engage in it are not in prison, so ending prisons will not flood society with predators. TV cop shows make it seem like prisons are full of the serial killers. But prisons are full of people from vulnerable communities who were in desperate situations and engaged with drugs, property crimes, or conflict with their friends, lovers, or families. So these are valid questions. These are very serious issues in society that still exist with a reliance on the prison industrial complex. Police and prisons have not solved these things. We have to look for actual solutions, like addressing complex issues at their core to really make our society safer. Even then, we will still have people harming each other. That's true and real. We can know police and prisons aren't the solution without having everything figured out about abolition. We have lots of good ideas, and society is always a work in process. SURJ simply asks us to allow ourselves to be open to imagining and believing in different and better solutions.
So how can we do this? How do we build the world we want to live in? And how do we get rid of prisons and police? We take care and we invest in communities. And this is not a pipe dream, y'all. This can happen. Police and prison abolition will not happen by magically snapping our fingers and simultaneously defunding the police systems of the world instantly. It is a process of strategically reallocating resources, funding, and responsibility away from those systems and toward alternative community-based models of care. And are you ready for the best news yet? There are already roadmaps for this work that we can follow. Just here up on your screen, the LA County Alternatives to Incarcerations Work Group. They generated just such a roadmap in their final report. The Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors passed a motion which brought together community advocates, service providers, community members, and staff from multiple county departments to develop this roadmap for diverting people from jail into care. So the resulting Alternatives to Incarceration Work Group, or ATI work group, developed and approved 114 recommendations to provide treatment and services to those in need instead of arrest or jail.
The successful implementation of these recommendations, some immediately and others over time, can redefine the roles of our healthcare and criminal punishment systems. We can commit to no longer rely on our law enforcement agencies, courts, and jails to function as our social safety net, and instead reinvest in our communities to build a robust system of care. The planning team organized their recommendations into 5 overarching strategies: expand and scale community-based holistic care and services, utilize behavioral health responses, avoid and minimize law enforcement responses, pretrial release and diversion services, treatment services and alternative placements instead of jail time, and effectively coordinate the implementation of these recommendations, ensuring that strategies work to eliminate racial disparities and to authentically engage and compensate system-impacted individuals. This vision can be implemented in any community. These strategies and recommendations in the report redistribute money and power to fund the infrastructures so that we don't need to rely on law enforcement ever. Rather than arresting people and sticking them in jail because their needs aren't being met, we meet their needs.
We don't need police or prisons. We don't. It's even more affordable to invest in communities over cops and jails, an added bonus. And we know how to do this. We do it all the time in our personal lives with our loved ones. So the solutions and vision for this world we want to live in are real. They're available. They just need to be implemented.
So to bring this all into the present moment, we're going to listen to an interview from this past June 3rd with a leader and co-founder of the Black Lives Matter movement, Patrisse Cullors, in a conversation with Boston NPR on Here and Now.
Joins us now on Skype. She co-founded Black Lives Matter in 2013. And Patrisse, since 2013, we've seen mass protests against police violence in Ferguson, Missouri after the killing of Michael Brown, and Baltimore after the death of Freddie Gray, really across the country. And now we're here again. Does this moment feel different to you?
This moment feels a lot of the same. A lot of the same kind of pain, a lot of the same kind of rage, but different because last time we experienced this moment, we didn't have as much national organization around what to do. And we've spent the last 7 years building out deep ties across the country because if we would have a moment like this again, and now we get to actually respond differently.
We've seen some police officers face consequences amid these protests. In Minneapolis, the officer who knelt on George Floyd's neck for more than 8 minutes has been charged. The mayor of Louisville fired his chief of police after the killing of a store owner there. What do you think would constitute justice in this moment that we're in right now?
a lot of people want accountability for that, or what these officers have done. So some people are asking for prosecuting law enforcement. I think that's a fine demand, and I think that's not a demand rooted in us being able to change the system. It's holding an individual accountable for their actions. An individual that is tied to an institution that has caused a lot of destruction. So I get that demand, but I do think that the demand of defunding law enforcement becomes a central demand, and how we actually get real accountability and justice, because it means that we are reducing the ability for law enforcement to have resources that harm our communities. And with that demand, it's not just about taking away money from the police, it's about reinvesting those dollars into Black communities, communities that have been deeply divested from, communities that some have never felt the impact of having true resources. And so we have to reconsider what we're resourcing. I've been saying we have an economy of punishment over an economy of care.
But what do you say to this argument that it's not that less money is needed to be spent on police, but actually reallocating the way that money is spent so that police can be for the good of communities and not in opposition of them?
Oh, it's not possible for law enforcement, the entity of law enforcement, to be a compassionate, caring governmental agency in Black communities. That's not the training, that's not the institution. We have spent the last 7 years asking for training, asking for body cameras. The body cameras have done nothing more than show us what's happening over and over again. The training has done nothing but show us that law enforcement and the culture of law enforcement is incapable of changing. And so what we're asking for is a reinvestment in how we understand what's needed in our communities. Why is law enforcement the first responders for mental health crisis? Why are the first responders for domestic violence issues? Why are they the first responders for homelessness? And so those are the first places we can look into, let alone let's talk about law enforcement's ability to surveil the community and how much money they're given in surveillance dollars every single year. The public has allowed for us to have militarized police forces in our communities, and we have to stop it.
So do you think, we've been talking a lot about these videos that have gone viral of protests around the country, of police officers kneeling and marching with protesters. Do you see these as distractions, or are you encouraged by these moments? Or do you feel like they're PR?
Colin Kaepernick was banned from the NFL for taking a knee for Black people, specifically looking at the ways law enforcement violence has impacted us. When the police take a knee, not only do I not take it seriously, it's disingenuous. Taking a knee is not stopping the deaths of our community members. We need radical shifts. We need transformation. These things don't happen through police taking a knee at protests and then right after they take a knee, getting up and tear gassing us and rubber bulleting us and beating us with batons.
That's Patrisse Cullors. She is one of the co-founders of Black Lives Matter. Patrisse, thank you.
Thank you so much.
So Patrisse Cullors, who we just listened to in this interview, wrote a piece in the Harvard Law Review called Abolition and Reparations, Histories of Resistance, Transformative Justice, and Accountability. So abolition isn't just a grand social idea. We can make a choice to live it out every day in our own lives. And she lays out 12 different things that people can do. And Emma, I'm going to ask, Amanda, I'm going to ask you to put this question in the chat. Which one of these principles is resonating with you the most? And while you're putting that in the chat, I'm going to read them. One, and then just put a number next to the one that you think resonates with you the most. One is have courageous conversations. 2, commit to response versus reaction. 3, experiment. Nothing is fixed. 4, say yes to one's imagination. 5, forgive actively versus passively. 6, allow oneself to feel. 7, commit to not harming or abusing others. 8, practice accountability for harm caused. 9, embrace non-reformist reforms. 10, build community. 11, value interpersonal relationships. And 12, fight the US state and do not make it stronger. All right, Harry, number 12, fight the US state. Joey, have courageous conversations. Emma, value interpersonal relationships. Yep, and Ben agrees with that. Cara, number 2, commit to response versus reaction. I hear you. Penny, number 12, fight the state. Yes, ma'am. Amanda, number 1, have courageous conversations. Elizabeth, build community. Yeah, and imagine if we put all these things together all at once. So, let's see. I'm skipping ahead a little bit, y'all, just because I don't want to go too much over time. Really value your time and value you being here. So I just want to say that now that we've gone through and experienced this Abolition House Party, we would just like you to share this information in your communities. And yeah, a few weeks ago, I couldn't have imagined talking so publicly about abolition. I thought I had to become more of an expert first. But my offering to you today is this. You've got this. There's no one right way of talking about it. We've just got to talk about it. And I believe that my community can't wait any longer for me to feel comfortable. It's time to take action now. We want you all to be leaders in these conversations in your own communities, because justice delayed is justice denied, as Martin Luther King said. And as Fannie Lou Hamer said, nobody is free until everybody's free. So here's some specific ways that you can take action now. You can sign up with your local chapter of SURJ and get connected. Here in New Orleans, there's the European Descent. And also we're fortunate to have the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. And Amanda's gonna drop the link for showing up for racial justice in the chat, as well as the link for participating in the SURJ National Phone Zaps. Those are on Wednesdays at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Those are hour-long actions with hundreds of people calling elected officials with demands to free them all and defund the police, ICE, and Border Patrol. I haven't had a chance to do this yet, but I've heard that they are awesome. You get to bug politicians. Emma's like, yes, do it. Yeah, and then there's also something called Collect Your Cousin's Phone Banks. That's on Saturdays and Thursdays. That is a SURJ campaign, phone banking, and you're calling majority white voters that other campaigns don't bother to talk to. So we also need to recruit other SURJ folks to help make these calls. So we're in the last 100 days or so before the election, so we're getting out the vote. Defeating Trump is crucial. We want to have a say in the conditions under which we will continue to organize. And this one is super important to me, the BREATHE Act. It's a national bill out of the policy wing of the Movement for Black Lives that divests our tax-paying dollars from policing and invests in a new vision of public safety. Exactly what we've been talking about. So please do everything you can to support the BREATHE Act. We're diverting funds into housing, education, and healthcare. This is the Civil Rights Act of our time. So learn more about the policy and tell other folks about it and sign it. Go to breatheact.org. I want you all to know that we've been part of Showing Up for Racial Justice, this Showing Up for Racial Justice pilot program, in which over 70 such political education events like this took place over the weekend, and we reached over 1,000 people. So you are part of something amazing. I'm so grateful that that you're all here with us. And thank you to my wonderful co-facilitators, Amanda, Emma, Deborah. Thank you so much. So, you know, whether you're new or, you know, to considering actively supporting abolition, or you've been an abolitionist for years, I hope you're as excited as I am to keep this conversation going. And if you drop your email in the chat, either just drop it in there for everybody or to me privately, I will send you all the references, these slides, everything. You're going to get it all, and you're going to be able to do something like this in the future if you want to. So I love you all. Thank you so much. And I don't know, do we have any outgoing music, Amanda? While people are dropping their emails.
I can get some.
Thank you. And if y'all want to unmute, I'd love to hear your voices. Thank you so much for being here.
Good job, Andrea.
Thank you, Andrea.
Yeah, that was really good. Fantastic.
Thanks, Andrea. That was amazing.
Thanks, Andrea.
Yeah, this was so good. You have to do this again so I can super promote it.
I totally will.
Awesome. Thank you.
There is no guidance in your kingdom.